Hi people, hope you're all well. If you're new to my channel, this would be, I guess, in some ways the typical sort of video I would make. It's a video where I just reflect on my views on a given issue and talk a lot about geopolitical issues. That's my niche, I guess. It's what I tend to focus on. I occasionally do film reviews. I occasionally go a little bit left field and talk about other issues. Recently had a video about artificial intelligence, and there may be some along those lines. Who knows? But I tend to be spontaneous. I tend to talk about whatever's on my mind at a given time, and I very rarely plan videos because I think this is a more natural approach. If I'm quoting someone, if I'm quoting out a news report, I will try to endeavour to quote the journalist where possible, where they're cited. Otherwise, I tend to just be quite spontaneous about this. So, if you like my content, please do subscribe. I'm close to 2,000 subscribers, so that would be a nice little milestone if I can get that. So please do subscribe. My videos tend to be a little bit longer. As I mentioned previously, I don't really do snapshot videos. Some people have like little brief 3, 4, 5 minute videos. Mine tend to average 15 to 20 minutes, if I'm being honest. And I'm not stupid. I know that people won't watch all of them. I know people might watch a few minutes, then, go and do something else. I do the same thing myself, but I just want it all there for the record. Like this was my take on a given issue in this particular video, and I don't think I could do that in a sort of snapshot way. Um, so that's my approach. The culture wars, this is something that we've heard about for years now. Um, and I'm not sure if the word is necessarily that apt, if it's necessarily that appropriate, because there is certainly issues there to do with culture in the sense of the way human society has developed particularly in the Western world. Although actually, I've heard this term even used in the Philippines and in India, so it's not purely a domain of the West. But yeah, primarily the West, primarily the United States, and to some extent Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the Anglophone world, basically, and of course the UK. But when we talk about culture wars, I think it makes sense when it gets into debates about, for example, how a nation sees itself, how a society sees itself, and when we get into matters like the calls to pull down statues and that sort of thing, I guess that's where culture wars make sense. But I also think it's a little bit, it doesn't quite sum up the complexities of this. So maybe partisan wars is a more accurate term because they are deeply, deeply partisan. Um, when we're talking about culture wars, we're not sort of talking about what one person's impression of a Manet painting is versus another person's impression of a Manet painting. That would be more sort of, I guess, apt for a culture debate. But or if someone prefers impressionist art to surrealist art, but the culture wars, we're talking about everything. We're talking about political discourse. We're talking about socio-political movements. But basically, I think they're unavoidable in terms of if you're someone like myself who does think about politics, who does think about what matters in society, what matters in human development, then it's almost impossible to avoid this. I mean, I don't think you can sit on the fence. I admire those who can. I think it's an achievement, but I think it's very, very difficult if you have any political DNA whatsoever, if you have any strong feelings about any subject, it's impossible to sit on the fence and just say, oh, well, everyone has their opinion. I disagree with everyone, or I don't have an opinion. I don't agree with anyone. You do get people who are much more interested in, um, I don't know, popular music or um, other forms of entertainment, and they would be less focused on the thing. And you can see that by their social media feed. It tends to be all about Uh, I don't know, it could be makeup or it could be Instagramming pictures, it could be gaming, all those things. And that's fine, you know. I don't begrudge that and I don't look down on it. In fact, sometimes I envy them. I sometimes think being apolitical would be a luxury because honestly, being political and thinking about these things can it can get quite distracting. And it goes without saying you cannot opine on everything at one time. So, you know, sometimes people are saying, if what do you think of this subject or this subject? It's not that I don't care about them, it's just that there's always so much going on at once. I mean, let's take today, for example, among many, many things happening. Let's see, there's the Diana Abbott dismissal from the Labour Party over the anti Semitism thing. There is on the same day, Don Lemon of CNN and Tucker Carlson of Fox News have both left their positions. They're both senior newsmen, but they're on opposite ends of the spectrum. Lemon on the left, Carlson on the right. Personally, I didn't have much time for either of them, so but it's kind of ironic that they both personify both ends of the culture war spectrum. I mean, Lemon's fairly woke, you know, he's a CNN contributor, anchorman. Apparently, he left over allegations of misogyny. I'm not sure what the details in Carlson's dismissal were, but I don't care because Carlson, as far as I'm concerned, was a stooge of the Kremlin. I think he was beyond despicable, quite frankly, in the sort of narrative he was putting out. And you know, something like this in itself, any one of those things I could talk about in detail. But I want to be a bit more general here. I want to just talk about how the culture wars in general, you know, how it's impossible not to opine on them if you are a political person, you know, because you're going to have thoughts on something, you're going to have certain angles that you look at something. And I don't know if there are many people that can truthfully say they're absolutely smack bang in the middle. Now, I call myself a centrist. Um, but I think there's a little bit of misunderstanding about what centrism is. Centrism is not and never has been sitting on the fence. It's never been about, oh, you know, I'm just going to be neutral on every issue. This is not what centrism is about. So there will be issues I will definitely take one side over the other. I mean, when it comes to tyrannies, I'm not going to say, oh, I understand the point of view of the tyranny and I'm going to condemn the dissidents. No, I'm not going to be neutral on something like that because that isn't what centrism is. It's not about standing in the middle. So why do I call myself a centrist? Because my overall views on things don't ultimately align one way or the other. You know, you get people who would be very comfortable wholly on the left, you know, and all their positions echo that, and that's fine. That's what they are. They're true to themselves. And the same with people on the right. You know, all their positions echo positions traditionally on the right. And even these terms, you know, they've had evolutions and changes in recent years, and there's been branches coming out from them, the hard right and the hard left, and so on. But that's why I say I'm a centrist, because although I hold some conservative views, particularly on crime, there's other areas I would be more on the left. So I just can't say I am a conservative, I am a socialist. It doesn't sum up how I feel about myself, and I think ultimately people should be allowed to, you know, I think we should have the freedom to describe ourselves under our own ideology. Um, of course, if people, you know, are demonstrating hypocrisy or contradicting themselves, then, you know, others can call that out. But some people have said you're not a centrist, you cannot say this, and no, I take ownership of it. I am. That's that's my natural ground. That's where I feel comfortable with. It doesn't mean that it doesn't mean that everyone else who calls himself a centrist I'm just going to agree with, and we all think alike. Just like you know, the left is a huge block, the right is a huge block, and I think sometimes it can get too tribal when it's sort of like you know, you right wingers, you left wingers. These are huge. huge contingents of political thought and persuasion. Um, and there's a lot of schisms within, and that's to be expected. I guess what I'm driving at is I feel sometimes people oppose the other side just for the sake of it. Now, if someone really is following their conviction and they believe that someone's opinion or their position is absolutely lamentable and they want to call it out, that's okay. They're being true to themselves. But I do think sometimes, and you see this in every media network, JB News can say it's different, but they do exactly the same thing as the mainstream media, which is they cherry pick and I just cite GB News because they make a big thing about not being the mainstream media, but really, they take a very anti-woke angle, and that's fine. I don't like wokeism. I am pleased that someone is standing up to it, but GB News is a little bit predictable. I mean, that's all they talk about. Like, okay, what's new? Um, the BBC is institutionally pretty left wing. Some, on the hard left will refute that and say it's actually a Tory organisation. But I feel something as big as the BBC can ever please everyone all the time. I just think that's impossible. Sky News, I don't think it's as lefty as the BBC. I'd say nowadays Sky is probably fairly centre ground. I used to think it was quite conservative compared to GB News, not really. Um, But that's what it is. I think ultimately we have to have the courage of our convictions and not just be tribal for the sake of it. So I'll give you an example. I dislike wokeism. I dislike the intolerance and the dogma and the extreme pettiness of wokeism, not to mention the double standard. So I might like a particular post that is calling out woke intolerance. But I may look at the group that that post has come from, and scroll down, and one of those posts is talking about how Russia's misunderstood and how Russia just had to invade Ukraine. So I often find that it isn't that easy to cement myself, and I don't really have a political home at the moment, if I'm being honest. I'm a little bit politically homeless because so often, there will be a good message and then it gets overshadowed by a bad message. Or, more often than not, you get a situation where there's a good, reasonable argument being made, but it gets overshadowed by dogma and let's just oppose for the sake of it. Um, and I think that's unfortunate. Now, I don't think that every single issue is a case of, well, let's just meet halfway. Like I say, I think it's okay to have strong views, and I think it's okay to stand up for them. I'm not going to say, like, for instance, someone who is a Putin supporter, I'm not going to meet them halfway because I think it's unconscionable what they support. I just don't see any moral argument in that at all, at all. I just that's a point of conviction. Now, people could say, "Well, you're biased." Fine, I'm happy to say I'm biased in that sort of area. So I've never claimed I'm never biased. This is a little bit of a red herring because bias doesn't necessarily mean dishonest. It just means what it means. It means you're taking one side over another. Now, when it comes to broadcasters, they have to be careful because perceptions of bias lead to an agenda. But for someone like myself, a private individual, I'm biased. Of course I am. I'm not going to pretend I'm not. I'm not going to pretend I'm absolutely neutral on every issue because I'm not. So people need to be a little bit more honest with themselves about what they are for and what they're against. And I think a lot of people spend too long condemning the other side without really checking themselves. Am I being consistent? Now, I don't want to be too preachy here because I'm applying this as much as myself to anyone. And have I always excelled? Probably not. There's probably times when I inadvertently was guilty of hypocrisy in some form or another. I can't think an example off the top of my head because I'm careful about it, but I'm not going to say I've been perfect. There may have been a time in the heat of the moment when I, let's say, shot from the hip, so to speak, and then someone would say, "Oh well, you had this position a while back," but I do try very carefully on this to be consistent. Um, Let me just cite an example off the top of my head. I don't like mob rule, right? So if I see someone being surrounded by a mob and yelling at them, my instinct is that's wrong. It's ugly. It's counterproductive. Regardless of my views on that person's politics, um, I don't think it's productive. Let me just play the devil's advocate for a second. If there was a Russia apologist, and let's say they were surrounded by a large group of pro-Ukrainian people, and those pro-Ukrainian people were yelling in their face and shouting at them and threatening them, I couldn't in good conscience support it. What I would say is, yes, the Russia apologists challenged. They're wrong, and I think they're wrong, but the problem is that just leads to a bad perception. It damages the image of what you're trying to do. And this is true in almost every situation. So perception is so important. And, no matter how righteous your cause might be, if you act in an obnoxious way, if you act in if you let anger cloud your judgment, then that can have an effect on wider perception. Um, Extinction Rebellion have really shot themselves in the foot many times. I came across a little video clip earlier where a guy, I haven't heard of him before, but he made a good point. He was filming the fact that at the London Marathon they offered to be stewards, but they arrived in these gas guzzling vehicles, and it's obviously sheer hypocrisy because they think they have a right to lecture the rest of us. Now, no one's perfect. I get that. And that's what they would say. They would say, oh, we know we're not perfect. The point about this is they have felt they've taken it on themselves to lecture the rest of us. They don't say, look, I think climate change is a major issue and we need to do something about it. But I know I'm not perfect. I know I'm also, using gas and oil. No, what they do is they deliberately disrupt the public, they deliberately hold the rest of us to ransom and lecture the rest of us. And whenever their hypocrisy is called out, they try to change the subject. So I've no respect for that level of arrogance. It's just if they want public respect, I'm not going to say too much here because I did cover this in one of my previous videos, but they've been doing this for 4 years. I'm afraid they've burned any bridges they might have had. Extinction Rebellion sort of the best of a bad bunch in the sense that they're the most moderate, and I say that cautiously because they have done some pretty polarizing things. But compared to Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil, they're a bit more. I'm not going to say reasonable. I think the proposals are very unrealistic, and I think there is something a bit cult-like about them. But the tactics are slightly less obnoxious than the other groups, slightly, ever so slightly. I mean, they're all interrelated anyway. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I just think that people need to have the courage to be true to themselves, and that sometimes means being prepared to be unpopular. It sometimes means that you have to, in order to stand up for your values, you have to be prepared to stand up for people you might not always agree with, you might not particularly like. I think that is where integrity comes from. I think the ability to say, actually, I don't particularly like this person, I don't like their views, but this is what I believe in, so I'm going to stand up for them. There's often that Voltaire quote, which may be misattributed, that, I do not agree with what you're saying, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it. It's sort of that principle. But again, believing in reason and believing in dialogue doesn't mean being smack bang in the middle, and it doesn't mean selling out, and it doesn't mean that you can't have strong views or pretend to like people that you don't. And one last thing, this notion of respecting all opinions is a fallacy. What people need to understand is there is the importance of respecting the right to have opinions. Now, I'm pretty much of the view that free speech has to be as broad ranging as possible. I'm not actually a free speech absolutist because free speech doesn't include a right to incite threats of violence. That's why it's not absolute, and it never has been. But I think it should be as broad reaching as possible, including the right to offend, including the right to have controversial opinions. The only caveat would be if there is clear incitement to violence or national security is implicitly threatened. But if someone's going to be, say, for instance, a private citizen wants to regurgitate the lies of the Kremlin, I grudgingly say they have a right to do it. I think they're full of it. I think they should be robustly challenged. I think they're basically stabbing this country in the back, and I've got no respect for them. But would I support them being arrested? No, I wouldn't. Because if anything, all that'll do is make them feel more pro Russia, which is ironic, of course. Russia is a country that has just jailed um, a man, Vladimir uh, Mirzakara, to 25 years in prison for speaking out against the Putin regime. So that's the sort of ideology they want to support. And they whine about liberty in the West. It's ironic. Anyway, I'll leave this here, but I hope it gives people something to think about. Thanks for watching.